Many years ago, I set myself on a path to preserve an important piece of my family history. Since he was a child, my grandfather was born into the life of a simple farmer. The family farm had been established by his forefathers at the turn of the century, and when he came of age, that task passed to him. He farmed his 200-acre lots from the time he was a kid through the late 60s, and by that time he had started a family of his own and continued to make a go of it. Agricultural policies had changed radically in the U.S. in the 1960s, favoring large-scale industrial operations. Making a living as a solo agrarian had become ever more difficult, and during this time he also started to suffer some health issues. So he made a career change to working as a carpenter in the construction business. But he kept his farm by selling off tracts and leasing his lots. His days of farming to make a living were over, but the farmer in him never died. As a young boy in the 80s, I was always fascinated by the myriad of farm relics from a bygone era that were littered in the declining outbuildings or scattered about the barnyard. One in particular was a massive machine that sat idle in a corner of his equipment shed, which was his 1956 Cockshutt Model 40. He had bought it new from a local dealer back in the day, and it was his pride and joy. It had a massive form factor and a stylistic quality that was truly unique. I grew up on stories from my grandpa, my dad, and my uncles reminiscing about life growing up on the farm, and it was apparent that this tractor was a big piece of that life, which they always carried with them. Even up to his last years, I could recognize in conversations how much he truly loved this machine and how much it meant to him. So 10 years ago, I hauled it over to my barn and parked it in the hope that someday I would fix it up to its original state of glory. This two-part video covers the first step of that journey, getting the engine back into running condition. It's composed of a series of photos that were taken during the fall and winter of 2020. If you enjoy this video, stick around for the second installment that covers the final assembly. This engine was manufactured by Buda, a company out of Harvey, Illinois, and it was used by Cockshutt in their Model 40 tractors from 1949 to 1958. It's a 230 cubic inch gas-powered, liquid-cooled inline six-cylinder that was rated for 38 horsepower at the drawbar and 43 horsepower at the PTO. The first step was removing the engine and making an assessment of its condition. Measurements of the end play and the running clearance on the main journals and connecting rods indicated that the bearings were worn outside the operating limits when checked against specs in the original Buda service manual. This was apparent from visual inspection. As you can see, the Babbitt material on several of the bearings was worn down to the core material. Baseline measurements were taken on each bearing and on the crank journals to determine the extent of the wear and if the crank needed to be reconditioned. Luckily, it checked out and only needed to have the journals polished, and I'll talk more about this later in the video. The engine had sat for many decades, so I knew from the start that the sleeves and pistons would be in bad shape and likely need to be replaced. All the bores had a significant amount of rust. The crankshaft is a massive one-piece forging that measures just short of 3 feet long. Many of the journals had a very fine ghosting in the area of the oil ring where it sat in the bearing, so I took several measurements to see if there was material loss. The running surfaces all mic'd out in spec for diameter and roundness, so I opted just to polish them. Next, I started pulling sleeves with the use of an extraction tool. These tools are available to purchase, but usually fetch a pretty hefty price, so I opted to make my own. It's made out of mild steel bar stock, some bolts, and a piece of all thread I harvested from scraps in my shop. It did the job just fine to get the sleeves to break out of their seats. A slide hammer was used to pull them the rest of the way out once the seals were broken, and in pretty short order. All 6 came out in about an hour. With the sleeves out, I really wasn't expecting the amount of pure crud that was inside the water jacket. Although not completely packed with filth, there was a ton of flaked red rust, dirt, and debris. In retrospect, it was likely that straight well water was once used as a coolant at some point, and this is likely the result. Using a scraping tool in the shop vac, I was able to get most of the loose gunk removed over several repeated cycles, and using a soft mallet to help knock loose the hard-to-reach areas. In preparation to go into a makeshift cleaning tank, all of the fittings and the pipe plugs were removed to allow access for engine cleaning tools. Nothing fancy, just a series of long pipe brushes to clear out the drilled oil passages. I chose to do an electrolytic process for rust removal because it's effective in breaking down the corrosion into solution and transporting it away from the block. This is a gentle process compared to mechanical methods that can remove base material like wire stripping, grinding, or media blasting. The corrosion products detach into solution and get plated out at the sacrificial cathodes. It also has the benefit of loosening old paint, making the removal of the original paint that much easier. This became known in my shop as the tank of skank. The electrolytic solution is water with sodium carbonate, also known as washing soda. This chemical salt is necessary to allow the solution to conduct low voltage DC current. I'm sure this process can be quite academic, and there's an optimal formula in the concentration for a given amount of applied current, but I winged it. I used about 3/4 cups salt per gallon of water and a constant current power supply set to 2 amps. You don't have to replace the solution, as the salt only functions to allow the media to conduct electricity and isn't part of any chemical reaction. I opted to change it out every other day because it's inexpensive and it tends to dirty fairly quickly, making it difficult to track the progress of the removal. It does tend to take some time. In all, it took a week or two of repeated wash cycles to get to the point of bare metal that I was shooting for. On this engine, the oil delivery is done by one large galley passage that runs the length of the block. At the intersection of each main cap is a smaller orifice cross-drilled to supply oil to the main bearings. I took care to thoroughly clean these out with a bore brush and solvent to remove any debris. This was repeated several times and blown out using compressed air. Some of these galley plugs were stripped out, so they had to be drilled and extracted with gentle heat from a MAP gas torch. After multiple immersions, repeated scraping, rinsing, and re-immersion, it was starting to get very clean. As time elapsed, less and less material was plating out on the cathodes, so I knew that the process was reaching the point where it would yield no more action. Any remaining debris at this point was easily removed with some brake cleaner and a Scotch-Brite pad. Any paint remnants just knocked off with an angle grinder fitted with a roll-lock Scotch-Brite wheel. Once I was satisfied, I did a thorough rinse and sprayed the entire block down with WD-40 to displace any residual moisture and to prevent flash rust. Inspection was done on the deck surface by magnet flux, paying special attention to the thin webs between the bores, and there were no detectable cracks. The sleeves were dry fitted to make sure the deck protrusion was within tolerance, and the seals were added and installed using soapy water. They seated in easily with a dead blow mallet and a block of wood. The engine block was now completely clean to the best of my ability, and I had to take care to prevent dust and debris collection. I used oil paper soaked with WD-40 and kept it wrapped in a large plastic bag when not being worked on. The deck surface was checked with a machinist straight edge, and it was very flat. I just cleaned up the gasket surface with an oil stone. Next, I turned my attention to the crankshaft and examining the witness marks on the journals. My first impression was that these were worn grooves. I had a set of very accurate micrometers, and these witness marks had no discernible thickness I could measure within a 10,000th of an inch. So I dressed the surfaces with some 2000 grit wet sandpaper and WD-40, followed by an application of a very fine machine polish using thin strips of denim jeans for a buffing media. This did a good enough job for removing the witness marks, and I suspect that this was an imprinting from the bearings to the crankshaft, having sat so long without engine oil. Moving on to the heads, I had my work cut out for me. The need for a deep clean was apparent, and I also had to tackle the problem of large carbon deposits in the valve ports. There was a similar story as the engine block for the state of the internal water passages. I used the Chem Dip product to soften and break up the carbon, allowing it to soak for a week or two, followed by more mechanical chipping with a nylon scraper, and finally a small rotary carbide, taking care not to touch the valve seats. Once I cleaned it out, I removed the original valve guides. The valve train on this head was not in good shape. The stems weren't bent, but it was clear that the valves didn't seat properly. There was evidence of oil leaking through many of the guide bores, none of which were concentric with the valve seats. Then back to the tank of skank to remove the rusts from the water passages. The end result was a very clean cast iron finish. New valve guides were installed to the spec height, so I had a good reference surface for the tapered pilot of the seat cutters. I used a set of cutters from New Way that have replaceable card-by inserts that do this task superbly. The intake seat's got a 3-angle treatment, and the exhaust only cuts 2 surfaces. In the close-up photos, you can faintly see the 3 distinct facets. This is a bit tedious because it involves cutting and checking with a marked-up valve to see where the seat lands on the valve, and then recutting if necessary to creep up on the desired contact zone. The valves were then hand-lapped to seat the 2 surfaces perfectly and break up the machine finish. One by one, these were completed until all were dialed in, and the umbrella seals and springs were installed. The rockers were next, and they were actually in great shape. All that was required was a deep cleaning and re-oiling of the bushings. These receive engine oil from an external pipe fitting that connects the main oil galley to the head. From there, it's piped through the center of the rocker shaft, and then it exits through the center back down into the oil pan. This was thoroughly cleaned inside and out, and the rockers reassembled, taking care to ensure that they were back in their original position. I ended up getting a new set of push rods, since the originals were pretty gross. These just got a quick hit with a Scotch-Brite, and they were checked for straightness on a surface plate. The rocker shaft was installed, and then the head was ready to go back on the engine. Stay tuned for part 2 of this video, where I document the reassembly of the engine. I hope that this was enjoyable and informative, and I thank you for watching.